Title: The Firefighter from Ground Zero. Introduction. On September 11, 2001, the world watched in horror as two planes crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. For many, it was a day of fear, pain, and loss. For firefighters like John McAllister, it was a call to action, one that would change his life forever. John's story is not just about the tragic events of that day, but about the long road to healing, resilience, and understanding the meaning of heroism. Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. John McAllister had been a firefighter for nearly 10 years by the time the world changed on that fateful September morning. Stationed at Ladder Company 7, a firehouse just a few blocks from the World Trade Center, John had seen his fair share of emergencies, from apartment fires to car crashes. Yet nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. The day began like any other, with the usual hustle and bustle of New York City. John had just finished his morning coffee and was chatting with his colleagues when the first alarm sounded, a report of a fire at the North Tower. No one at the firehouse could have imagined the magnitude of the situation. As they geared up and boarded the truck, the sight of smoke billowing from the World Trade Center quickly made it clear that this was no ordinary fire. Chapter 2. The Collapse. Arriving at the scene, John and his crew were met with chaos. People were running in every direction, covered in dust and debris. The tower loomed above them, flames licking at the sky. As they rushed into the building, the ground trembled beneath them. John could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders, both literally and figuratively. The team worked furiously to evacuate as many people as possible, navigating through the dense smoke and choking dust. Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the air. John looked up just in time to see the upper floors of the North Tower buckle and collapse. Everything went dark. When John awoke, he was buried under rubble. Hours seemed to pass in a haze of pain and confusion before he was finally pulled to safety. But many of his colleagues weren't so lucky. The collapse of the towers claimed the lives of hundreds of first responders, and John was left to grapple with the overwhelming weight of survivors' guilt. Chapter 3. The Aftermath. The days and weeks following 9/11 were a blur. John threw himself into the rescue and recovery efforts at Ground Zero, working long hours despite his injuries and emotional exhaustion. It was a grueling process, both physically and mentally. The smell of burning debris lingered in the air, and the constant reminder of those who hadn't made it out alive haunted him. As the world watched the cleanup efforts unfold, John became a silent hero. His name was never in the headlines, but those who worked alongside him knew of his dedication and bravery. Yet, for John, heroism felt like a hollow word. The loss of so many comrades weighed heavily on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed them. Chapter 4. A New Battle. In the months that followed, John struggled to adjust to life outside the ruins of Ground Zero. His physical injuries healed, but the emotional scars ran deep. Nightmares plagued his sleep, and he found it difficult to connect with his family and friends. The firefighter who had once been full of life and laughter was now distant and withdrawn. It wasn't until a fellow firefighter suggested attending a support group for first responders that John began to confront his trauma. At first, he was reluctant. The idea of talking about his feelings seemed foreign to him. But as he listened to others share their stories, he realized that he wasn't alone. The shared pain of those who had experienced the same horrors helped him to slowly begin the process of healing. Chapter 5. Rediscovering Purpose. As the years passed, John continued to work as a firefighter, but his perspective had changed. He no longer saw his job as just a profession, it was a calling, a way to honor the memory of those he had lost. He also became involved in advocacy efforts for the health and well-being of first responders, many of whom were suffering from long-term health issues related to their work at Ground Zero. Through his advocacy work, John found a renewed sense of purpose. He spoke at events, sharing his story and raising awareness about the ongoing struggles of 9/11 survivors. His journey wasn't easy, but it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Chapter 6. Never Forget. 20 years after the attacks, John stood at the 9/11 Memorial, looking up at the new One World Trade Center. The city had rebuilt, but the scars of that day remained. As he laid a flower at the base of the memorial, he thought of his friends, his colleagues, and all those who had lost their lives. John McAllister was not the same man he had been on September 10, 2001. The events of 9/11 had shaped him, challenged him, and forced him to confront the darkest parts of himself. But they had also shown him the true meaning of courage, sacrifice, and hope. As he turned to leave, John smiled faintly. He had found peace, not in forgetting, but in remembering. Chapter 7. Rebuilding the Bonds. As John continued his work as a firefighter, the weight of the events of 9/11 never truly left him. He tried to immerse himself in the routine of daily life, but the haunting memories of that day had built an invisible wall between him and his loved ones. His wife, Emily, noticed how distant he had become. Their once lively conversations turned into short, practical exchanges. His kids, who used to see their dad as a hero, now found him cold and preoccupied. One evening, after another sleepless night filled with nightmares, Emily sat John down. "We need to talk," she said softly, but with urgency in her voice. "I know you've been through hell, but you can't keep shutting us out. We're your family. Let us help." John stared at the floor, his hands clasped together. He wanted to say something, but the words were stuck. How could he explain the survivor's guilt, the endless cycle of reliving that day, and the feeling that no matter what he did, he would never be able to escape it? Emily took his silence as confirmation that things weren't going to change. "I've found a therapist who specializes in trauma. I think you should go," Emily said, breaking the silence. John initially resisted the idea. He was a firefighter, after all, a protector, a man of action. Therapy felt like admitting weakness. But after a particularly rough night where the memories became too much to bear, John reluctantly agreed to go. Chapter 8. Confronting the Past. John's first session with Dr. Clara Richardson was uncomfortable. He didn't know where to start. The room felt too quiet, the ticking of the clock on the wall too loud. Clara, an experienced trauma therapist who had worked with many first responders after September 11th, was patient. She encouraged John to start with what he felt comfortable talking about. Slowly, over several sessions, John began to open up. He talked about the day of the attacks, the weight of the debris pressing down on him after the collapse, and the faces of the people he couldn't save. He spoke about his comrades who didn't make it out and how their families still haunted him. "You did everything you could, John," Clara would remind him, though the words were hard for him to accept. The process of confronting his trauma was grueling. John had to revisit the darkest moments of his life, but in doing so, he began to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning how to live with the memories. Chapter 9. The Long Road Home. As John continued therapy, he also started to repair his relationships at home. He began talking to Emily more openly about his feelings, sharing the things he had kept bottled up for years. He also made an effort to reconnect with his children, attending their soccer games, helping with homework, and being present in ways he hadn't been before. His kids noticed the change. "Dad, you're finally back," his son, Jake, said one evening, hugging him tightly after John had cheered him on at a school event. It was a simple gesture, but for John, it was a moment of redemption. He wasn't just the man who had survived Ground Zero. He was a father and a husband who was slowly finding his way back to the people who loved him. Chapter 10. A New Mission. Though John had begun to heal, he knew that many of his fellow firefighters and first responders were still struggling. Health issues related to the toxic dust and debris at Ground Zero were becoming more common, and many first responders were fighting battles they never expected to face: cancer, respiratory problems, and mental health challenges. John threw himself into advocacy work, fighting for better healthcare and support for 9/11 survivors. He joined organizations dedicated to helping first responders get the medical treatment they deserved and traveled to Washington, D.C., to testify before Congress about the long-term effects of 9/11 on firefighters and other emergency workers. His advocacy work became his new mission in life. He was no longer just focused on his own healing. He was determined to make sure that his fellow firefighters were taken care of, even if they couldn't fight for themselves. For John, this was a way to honor those who had fallen that day and ensure their sacrifices were never forgotten. Chapter 11: The Unexpected Reunion. One day, during a fundraising event for 9/11 survivors, John encountered a familiar face. It was Luis Gomez, a paramedic who had been one of the first responders on the scene that day. Luis had been trapped under the rubble with John but had been rescued hours later, long after John had been pulled to safety. The two men hadn't seen each other in nearly a decade. "John, I can't believe it's you," Luis said, his voice filled with emotion. The two embraced, a bond forged in the worst of circumstances but strengthened by their shared experience. They talked for hours, recounting the events of that day, but also catching up on the years since. Luis had left the paramedic field after September 11th, struggling with his own PTSD, but had found a new calling working with veterans who had returned from combat. Their stories were different, but the trauma was similar. Their reunion reminded John that the connections made during 9/11 were lifelong. He and Luis hadn't spoken in years, but their bond was unbreakable, forged in the crucible of Ground Zero. Chapter 12: A Future of Hope. As the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks approached, John was invited to speak at a memorial service at Ground Zero. Standing in front of the reflecting pools, where the names of the victims were etched into the stone, John took a deep breath. He thought about all the lives lost that day, about the families who still mourned and the firefighters who never came home. But he also thought about resilience, about how the city had rebuilt itself, and how, despite everything, people had found a way to move forward. John's speech wasn't just about the past, it was about the future. He spoke of hope, of healing, and of the importance of never forgetting the sacrifices made by so many. As he finished speaking, he looked out at the crowd and saw his family, Emily, Jake, and his daughter Sophie, all smiling at him. For the first time in years, John felt a sense of peace. He knew that the pain of that day would never fully disappear, but he also knew that it didn't have to define him. He had survived, he had healed, and now, he was ready to face whatever the future might bring. Conclusion: The Legacy of Ground Zero. John McAllister's story is one of many from the tragic events of 9/11, but it represents the resilience of the human spirit. His journey from a firefighter caught in the midst of a national tragedy to a man who fought for healing, for himself and others, serves as a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope can still be found. As the years pass and the memories of that day continue to shape his life, John remains committed to honoring the legacy of those who didn't make it out of the towers. Through his advocacy, his family, and his personal journey of healing, he continues to be a beacon of resilience and strength.